In the 1970s, the Playtime Company toy factory stood in the town of Ravens Hollow. It was the largest manufacturer of children's goods until it suddenly closed. The reasons remained a mystery, but shortly afterward, children began disappearing in the town. The only connection between the disappearances was the factory. The townspeople talked about strange sounds coming from behind its walls and shadows flickering in the night. Teenagers Thomas, Emily, and Mark knew these rumors but treated them as fiction. Until 12-year-old Jake, Emily's younger brother, disappeared. The authorities wrote his disappearance off as an accident, but his friends didn't believe it. They decided to sneak into the factory to find answers. Late at night, they entered through a broken fence. The building inside looked abandoned, but too neat. There wasn't the usual chaos of neglect. It was as if everything had been waiting for them. There was a pungent odor of rubber and oil in the air, and childish footprints in the dust on the floor. As they walked on, they noticed a door with a sign that read Development Department. The door was damaged, as if someone had tried to close it but failed. Thomas pushed it open, and it creaked open. Behind her was a room filled with toys that looked all too realistic. Their faces were frozen in creepy smiles, and their glass eyes seemed alive. Among the old papers on the table was a videotape labeled Prototype. Final version. Before they could examine the find, a scrambling sound came from the depths of the corridor. Someone was moving in the darkness. They froze. Silence. And then footsteps. Someone, or something, was coming towards them. Thomas slowly turned his head toward the exit. In the dim light of the flashlights, the shadows on the walls seemed alive. There was a new sound in the distance, a light scratching, like something moving on the floor. It was coming closer. They stopped. Something was there, in the darkness. The sound of footsteps, heavy and uneven, like someone moving on limbs too long, echoed in the corridor. An icy fear gripped his body. Holding his breath, Thomas noticed yellow documents among the scattered papers. They looked as if someone had pulled them out of their folders in a hurry. One of the sheets was a child's drawing of a factory and a dark figure standing next to it with huge hands and empty eyes. The other paper contained strange notes. Under test subject it read, Subject 3-08. Age, 6 years. Next to it was a note, Viability of consciousness in inorganic matter. Progress, partial. The teenagers froze. Their eyes darted from the documents to the toys scattered around them. Suddenly, 2 glowing dots lit up in the darkness. They looked like eyes. But not human. For a split second, everything froze. And then there was a rustle. The figures that had seemed inanimate were now moving. A low whisper came from down the corridor. They came. At that moment, the teens realized that they had made a fatal mistake. The factory wasn't abandoned. It was just waiting for new guests. As they rushed to escape, the corridors of the factory began to change. Dark passageways that had seemed simple now led to unexpected dead ends, and familiar doors disappeared behind their backs. The factory was alive. It was moving. It didn't want to let them go. They found themselves in a long, narrow corridor where the walls were covered with children's drawings. There was something disturbing about them. Figures with outstretched limbs, toys with their mouths wide open, children drawn with empty eyes. Some of the pictures looked fresh, as if someone had recently left them here. In one of the rooms they found old blueprints. They were sketches of toys, but not ordinary toys. They had extra joints, disproportionately long arms, and jaws filled with sharp teeth. In the center of the table was a piece of paper with the caption, Children give toys life. Literally. The teens felt a chill run down their backs. They could no longer ignore the obvious. This factory made more than just toys. It used children. Something stirred in the far corner of the room. Old dolls and plush animals stood in the darkness, but they didn't seem lifeless now. Their fingers moved slowly, as if listening. Their eyes were empty, but it was as if something flickered inside them. Then there was a quiet sound. A click. One of the teddy bears smiled. The teenagers froze. They realized they had too little time. Suddenly, there was a scream. A shrill one, filled with terror. One of the teenagers had disappeared. His flashlight was lying on the floor, and there was no sign of him. Only a frightening silence. The others froze, trying to realize what had just happened. Panic squeezed their hearts. They couldn't stay here. Running around the factory looking for a way out, they came across an old journal. Names were written in it. Dozens, hundreds. Some had strange marks against them, like the results of some kind of test. They realized they were the names of missing children. A creak sounded behind him. A shadow slid down the wall. A tall, unnaturally elongated figure with long arms and fangs slowly emerged from the darkness. Its eyes, fathomless and dead, stared straight at them. The factory wasn't just expecting new guests. It was going to keep them. The old tape lay among the chaotically scattered documents. On its label was a single word, truth. Thomas shakily inserted it into the projector hidden in the corner of the room. A crackling sound came from the speakers, then the tape played. A man in a lab coat appeared on the screen. His face looked haggard, with deep shadows under his eyes. He was breathing heavily, looking around the lab behind him. They want to live, his voice was shaky. But a soul isn't just energy. We shouldn't have done this. We didn't realize that transmigrating consciousness into matter has consequences. They're not dead, but they're not alive either. They're, stuck. And now, they're hungry. The picture flashed, the screen went dark for a moment. Then the next image appeared, a laboratory, children's beds hooked up to strange equipment. Small silhouettes lay motionless. In the corner of the frame, an eerie inscription on the wall read, "Live forever." The teens recoiled from the projector. They didn't need any more guesswork. They knew what was happening here. The factory owner had found a way to transmute children's souls into toys, creating living dolls. They hadn't disappeared. They were still here. There was a thud. Slow, heavy breathing came from behind the door. The factory had heard them. They had to run. Immediately. The factory came into motion. The walls seemed to shrink, the corridors changed into a maze, and the door through which they had entered now led to another room. The flames of their flashlights shook as a huge doll with a distorted, almost human face appeared in the way. It was over 2 meters tall, its long arms dragging across the floor and its mouth stretched in a sinister smile. The teenagers rushed in different directions, but the toy moved faster than seemed possible. It drove them to a dead end, an iron grate blocking the way to the exit. Someone had to stay. Mark, the oldest of them, suddenly turned around. He knew they were out of time, knew that if they didn't get out, no one would know the truth. He grabbed a metal pipe lying on the floor and struck the old electrical panel with force. The sparks blinded them for a moment, and then there was a crackling sound. The light flickered, and the doll stopped, its head jerked to the side. Mark shouted for the others to run, and he stayed behind. Thomas and Emily climbed out through the vent. They didn't know what had happened to Mark. The last thing they heard was his scream echoing through the building. They jumped outside and, out of breath, ran to the nearest station where they tried to explain everything to the police officers. The officers were skeptical of their story, but still went back with them. But when they got back to the factory, it was sealed up. Doors welded shut, windows boarded up. No sign of their recent entry. No sign of Mark. The police searched the area but found nothing suspicious. It looked as if the building had been abandoned for years. Thomas and Emily couldn't believe what was happening. As they were about to leave, Emily froze. There was a teddy bear lying in the grass by the gate. Dirty, tattered, with a name embroidered on his paw. Mark. She picked it up with trembling hands, but when she looked at the toy's face, her heart sank. The teddy bear's eyes blinked slowly. The story of Playtime Company wasn't over. It was just beginning. Years later, Emily stopped in front of the window of a small antique store downtown. A lot had changed in her life, but the past never let her go. She didn't like coming back to Raven's Hollow, but fate had brought her here again. In a glass display case among old dolls and toy cars sat him. A teddy bear. The same teddy bear, with his name embroidered on his paw. Emily's heart sank. She swallowed, trying to convince herself it was just a coincidence. But before she could turn away, the bear slowly turned its head. A muffled, barely audible whisper came from under the glass. "You promised you'd come back."